Hey friends, it's that time again. Thank you for joining me for the Church Tech Today podcast. Today, I'm going to go through some research that was just published by the Unstuck group. And it's all encapsulated in an article that you can find on ChurchTechToday.com. The headline of the article is, "Has your church stopped streaming online? Here's data for why that might be a mistake." And so we're going to go through some of the stats. Now, the Unstuck group, led by Tony Morgan, monitors church growth, leadership trends in churches throughout the United States, right? And every single quarter they put out a report. This time, Q3 of 2024, this report focuses on the key differences in behavior between churches that are experiencing growth and churches that are experiencing decline. And at Church Tech Today, we are interested in digital strategies, right? The ones that are strategic, the things that you can do to accelerate the impact of your church. And we want to take advantage of the significant shifts that people are actually going through in terms of their behaviors and their relationships as they relate to their church community as well as their own personal faith journey. And so this report that just came out, I think, offers a couple of stats that will give you some insights for especially churches that have decided to stop live streaming or considered cutting back on budgeting or headcounts for digital ministry. Things like online webinars and online small groups and online worship services. And there's all these things that we were doing during COVID that everyone has scaled back. And this data, I think, is eye-opening and will give you pause if you were in that decline trend in terms of defunding church online and digital ministry. So the one statistic that I thought was interesting is that Tony Morgan's team actually surveyed the actual growth trend year over year for in-person services as well as church online services. And this is fascinating to me, right? So we've seen since COVID that there has been a upward trend in in-person services attendance, right? So depending on what other research you've seen, some stats say, hey, churches have basically come back to pre-COVID numbers and others have surpassed it. We should not be thinking about recalling all those people back. We should be thinking about growth. And I think that's what's finally happened in most leadership teams' minds. And so this is why year over year in person, the churches that have surveyed and participated said they've seen on average 17% growth of people coming to their building for worship services. Now that's great. The thing that I think is super interesting, especially as a former church online pastor, is that for church online, the online service views has grown by 32%. The number of churches participating are hundreds and hundreds that have participated in the survey, and they've seen a 32% growth in online views. What does that mean? Well, the first takeaway, I think, is that there are people that say church online cannibalizes what we can do in person. The reason why we want to cut off streaming is because we don't want to give people a lazy option so that they don't have to come to church. We have all these excuses, but really, streaming services really does not cause a decline in physical attendance. I mean, these numbers just prove that point. Instead, I think you can conclude the opposite, which is online services actually complements in-person worship, and you'll see that growing churches are seeing a higher percentage of online views overall. So this is just one of those things where this trend really should give you pause if you're thinking about how do we cut back on church online and digital ministry and offering online groups and all these other things that I think can be a creative flourishing for your digital expression of what you do for the gospel. And so this hopefully will give you fodder so that your entire leadership team can actually discuss it. Now, the report identified several distinguishing features of growing churches versus declining churches, right? So the growing churches have a higher percentage of online service use, right? And in terms of worship style, I think this was a very interesting piece. And the report goes into many, many other categories and other insights, so you should download the report and see it. But in terms of worship style, growing churches are more likely to offer contemporary worship services exclusively versus declining ones were the ones that had traditional worship services as a hybrid and a mixture with contemporary. So what do you draw from that? When you are trying to reach new people, bringing new people in are the ones in the well, if you go to the bar graphs that we published at ChurchTechToday.com, that differential, that incremental growth is coming from new people coming into your church, not your existing ones. So your existing people might appreciate the traditions of hymns and traditional services, but what I think this is inferring is that when you're reaching new people, new visitors, first-time visitors, that traditional worship services may not be the tip of the sword that really gets them in the door. You may need to appeal to a different, or you might use a different style of worship to appeal to a broader audience. And in particular, I think for the Church Online ministry department, maybe that's the thing that you focus on. More contemporary worship exclusively for your online version. So there's many different philosophies of how we do ministry online. One of the things that I've always said is that we want to respect the medium and the channel, and that you don't want to just copy paste what you're doing in one medium and go to another. For example, when we went from radio to TV, we didn't just see, hey, let's just take the audio file and broadcast it as a TV show and don't do any visuals. No, TV actually has the ability to transmit video. So you saw that rapid adoption of video in terms of programming for the TV versus radio. Same thing with in-person worship versus online worship. You should think about, what does online offer that's different and better than in-person worship, and how do you take advantage of those things so that it's not just a copy paste? So are there things that you can do, simple things, right? So square one, I would think about things like, is there content that you can actually broadcast that's different than in-person services at the appropriate moments in the service? So online giving, right? So online giving, could you do an appeal and offering talk that is talking contextually to the church online audience versus the ones that are in person? Announcements and calls for volunteers would be different for online and geographically distant people than for the ones in person, right? So there's all these things that you can actually start to think about of, what do we do in terms of worship online versus offline? And the other thing I think is a larger question, and we should go into it in another episode, is that maybe you don't need to do everything that you do offline in person in an online service. That it doesn't need to be a one-to-one matchup going all the way down the liturgy and the functions and objectives of each of those worship services. Can they be different expressions? So anyway, back to the survey. Worship style was one of the things that the Unstuck group surveyed against, and those that exclusively offer contemporary worship are the ones that were most likely in a growing church. So one of the big fat conclusions that is noted in the report, and they say, quotes, streaming your services online doesn't cause attendance decline. If anything, it has an opposite effect. Streaming services online doesn't cause attendance decline. If anything, it has the opposite effect. So I think if you want to have some intentionality of going further, that you're going to see even larger gains than the ones that are being reported here. So some quick strategic takeaways for Digital Church. I think instead of focusing on content and publishing and just one-way communication, I would focus on connection, right? We are currently living in a world facing a loneliness epidemic, and digital platforms have lots of functionality that can help foster community and connections. Now, it doesn't need to all be live. There's many things that are asynchronous, right, or hybrid, and including live types of modalities. But how do we rethink that to focus on connection as the objective, not just publishing content, right? Second one, I think that we need as leaders to have this thinking to be able to adapt and innovate. There's changing preferences, changing technology options. There's all these things that are continuously evolving, And we need to make sure that what we're doing on the digital side, um, that all that stuff aligns strategically with not just the mission of our church and objectives, but also the needs of our audience. So if you think from like a story brand perspective where your audience is the hero, it is their journey, not yours, that you're inviting them into a broader story, but they're the ones where we're looking at their felt needs, the context of their daily living, and how do we actually adapt and innovate what we do and how we relate to them and offer the opportunities for connection, not just for us to them as the church to an individual, but maybe also peer to peer, right? And that's one of the beauties of the internet, that it is very efficient and allows us to make those connections. So anyway, you need to adapt and innovate is the second pillar. The third strategic takeaway is that you have to curate your digital worship, right? That's live services, but also on-demand viewing and the library and how that actually is offered and is easy to access. And does on-demand viewing just mean let's just record the entire service and post it as is and someone needs to scrub through an hour and a half video file? Or do you start to curate and edit and chop it up and make it much easier for them to search for things, find things, consume things, so that they actually are fulfilled and actually serve their own needs quicker in an online environment? And especially in the mobile first world right now, I think that is a really, really big question in terms of how do we curate digital worship and attendance for live worship services online. Interactive elements, surveys, polls, gamification, breaking up into small groups. There's all these things that we have tools available to us to be able to experiment with and start to figure out how do we adapt and innovate and then focus on connections. Beyond that, I think there's some other insights that the church report has that I think can open up further discussions outside of just the comms team or just the senior pastor and leadership team. And that is, they found that more than 1 in 5 churches now are multi-site. And of course, multi-sites, a significant number of them are offering online services. But the trend shows the expanding reach of churches through digital means. As churches grow, they understand it's much more impactful and efficient to achieve that outreach and new connections objective as they go out. So more than 1 in 5 churches now are multi-site. That's just something I think is just interesting for a lot of churches, whether you are the average size church, and I just read another stat, I believe at least in one denomination, the average size of the church now has shrunk down to about 60 people. And we're not just talking about mega churches anymore, right? And so there are many things that every church at every size and phase of their growth can start to think about what does online presence mean for them. The second insight that was very interesting is children's ministry attendance is increasing, but they're becoming a smaller percentage of the overall church attendance, right? That's a very interesting stat to think about. Children's ministry attendance might be increasing, but it's becoming a smaller portion of the pie of overall church attendance. So what does that mean? How do we bring more younger audiences into the church? And with the digital first and digital native generation, do we need to start thinking about how do we produce specific digital content for that segment of our community? Is there a space for producing content, curating content, that it's not just adult content that we're broadcasting to adults, but what are we doing for the children? We know as church planters that if you cater to families with young children, that's one of the fastest segments to fuel your growth. So with Church Online and digital ministry, it's not just your Sunday services, but with digital ministry, what can you do in terms of your content to focus and serve the younger audiences? And the secondary audiences obviously are the parents of those younger children. The third one that I think is interesting is home groups are increasingly becoming the primary option for connecting people beyond weekend services, right? So small groups. And this shift towards digital interaction and home-based gatherings instead of large format, hey, let's just go to the church building and do something in big, large group format for the church, it's crucial. And it's crucial to think about when you're trying to build community in today's age. So there you have it. You should go download the Unstuck Church Report. It has a lot of information in there that would be very useful for any team that is thinking through how to actually take your church to the next level in a very thoughtful and strategic way as you move forward. So the Q3 2024 report is out. You should download it. And I'd love to hear your feedback and your insights as you read the report and what your church is going through in terms of live streaming and church online. I'm Kenny Jahng. Thank you so much for listening. I'll check you here at the next episode of the Church Tech Today podcast.